Out here, the wind has a way of talking. It slides down the Shrieto foothills, kicks up the dust, and whispers secrets of sagebrush and long-gone winters. For a man like Eli Mercer, it was the only conversation he wanted. He stood at his fence line, one boot hooked on the bottom rail, the sun just cracking the horizon. The light spilled across his 50 acres of hard-won dirt like liquid gold. This was his kingdom, a kingdom of stubborn cattle and even more stubborn silence. For 5 years, Dust Creek had been his fortress. No nosy townsfolk, no bounty hunters sniffing around for ghosts, and absolutely no memories clawing their way out of the dark. At least that's how it was supposed to be. But this morning, the wind was whispering something new, something red. It was the blood that caught his eye first. A dark, ugly smear on the sandy trail near the creek bed. It was fresh. So fresh it glistened, like a wet wound on the dry earth. Eli's jaw went tight as a rusted bolt. He'd seen his share of blood in his day. This wasn't some coyote snagging a rabbit. This wasn't an animal. This was human. His hand, almost without him thinking, drifted down and rested on the worn handle of the Colt holstered on his hip. He moved slow, following the trail. It wasn't hard to track. Whoever it was, they were hurt bad. You could see the stagger in the footprints, the way they dragged one foot. You could see the handprints in the dust where they'd stumbled, trying to catch their balance, and you could see the streaks of crimson they'd left behind on the brush, like a painter gone mad. The tracks led him right down to Dust Creek, that lazy ribbon of water that cut through his land like an old scar. And that's where he found her. She was slumped near the bank, half hidden under the twisted branches of a pinyon pine. A woman, young, maybe late 20s. Her blonde hair was a tangled mess, caked with dirt and blood. Her dress, which might have been blue once, was torn to shreds, stained with the story of her desperate escape. One of her hands was pressed tight to her side, soaked through with dark, sticky red. Eli stopped dead in his tracks. Every bone in his body, every instinct he'd honed over years of running from trouble, screamed at him. Turn around. Walk away. This ain't your fight. Trouble was the very thing that had driven him out here, to the edge of nowhere, to this patch of dirt where the only thing that could bother him was the wind. He didn't know her. He didn't want to know her. But then she moved. Her head rolled weakly to the side. Her eyes cracked open, and even through the pain, they were sharp, gray like a storm cloud. Fierce. There was fear in them, sure. But underneath it, there was something else. Defiance. The kind you don't learn in a fancy city school, the kind you earn the hard way. Her cracked lips parted, and her voice was barely a whisper, carried on that same dry wind. They're after me. Eli didn't move. His hand was still a breath away from his Colt. His own voice, when it finally came, was rough and cracked from disuse. Who's after you? She swallowed, a painful, difficult thing. Her eyes fluttered, trying to stay open. Boone. She choked on the name. Copper Boone. And with that, her head lolled to the side, and she went limp. Copper Boone. The name hit Eli like a physical blow, a rock straight to the gut. Boone's gang was a plague on this part of New Mexico territory. They were ruthless animals who rustled cattle, robbed miners, and left a trail of bodies wherever they went. They were the reason vultures learned to circle early. Eli's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. He should walk away. The smart move was to saddle his horse and be halfway to Arizona before Boone's crew even caught her scent. But he looked down at her, soaked in blood, half dead by his creek, and he knew. Eli Mercer already had enough ghosts. He couldn't stand to have one more. He let out a slow breath, slid the Colt back into its holster, and knelt beside her. Easy now, he muttered, more to himself than to her. He slipped a strong arm under her shoulders. Her skin was hot, feverish. She was lighter than he expected, all sharp bones and pure grit, held together by nothing but sheer will. Looks like you picked the wrong damn creek to bleed out by, miss, Eli said under his breath, lifting her into his arms. The ranch wasn't far, but with every single step he took, he knew he was dragging hell itself right to his front door. And just like that, the 5 years of peace at Dust Creek were over. The old ranch house was more of a shack, really. Weathered timber, a roof that leaked in 3 different places, and the stubborn smell of wood smoke that never quite left the walls. But it was Eli's. It was his sanctuary. Now as he carried the wounded stranger inside, it felt like the whole place was holding its breath right along with him. He laid her down easy on the worn leather couch near the cold hearth. She let out a faint groan, her face ghostly pale under the streaks of grime and dried blood. Eli moved on instinct, the part of him that was a soldier before he was a rancher taking over. He fetched a basin, filled it with clean water, and grabbed the least dirty rag he owned. "You ain't dying on my floor," he muttered, kneeling beside her. He carefully cut away the torn fabric of her dress. The gash on her ribs was ugly, jagged and deep. It looked like someone had tried to carve their name in her. She flinched when the cold, wet rag touched her skin. "Easy," he said again, his voice softer than he intended. "Ain't here to hurt you." Her eyes flickered open again. They were still glassy with pain, but that defiant sharpness was back. "Who says you ain't trouble yourself?" A tiny, faint smirk touched Eli's lips. It was the first time he'd smiled in, well, he couldn't remember how long. "If I was trouble, you'd be dead already." She seemed to consider that, her lips twitching. Maybe she believed him. Maybe she was just too tired to argue. "You got a name?" he asked, rinsing the rag. The water in the basin turned pink, then red. "Clara," she rasped. "Clara Dalton." "All right, Miss Dalton, you're safe here. For now." But her gaze hardened. The fear was back, sharp and immediate. "Safe? Boone's men." "Boone's not here. Yet," Eli said, his voice low. "But you and your trail of blood are a pretty clear invitation." Shame flickered in her eyes. She tried to sit up, a move that sent a fresh wave of crimson soaking through the rag he'd pressed to her side. "Lie still," he ordered, his voice firm but not unkind. He gently pushed her back down. "Ain't your fault they're monsters." He worked in silence, cleaning the wound as best he could, binding it tight with strips of an old linen shirt. The soldier in him knew how to patch up a body, but the man in him, the man who'd buried a wife and a son after a run-in with men just like Boone, he knew that patching up a life was a whole different story. When he was done, her breathing was a little steadier, though her skin was still the color of ash. "You said Boone's after you," he prompted, sitting back on his heels. "Why?" Clara hesitated. Her eyes searched his face, trying to read him, trying to decide if he was a savior or just the next man who would betray her. The desperation must have won out. "I worked at the miners' camp," she whispered, her voice raw, "up at Dust Creek Gulch. They found a new vein, silver, enough to make a man rich for 10 lifetimes. Eli grunted. That explained it. Greed was a more powerful force than a flash flood. "They wanted to keep it quiet," she went on, her voice trembling. "But Boone's crew, they found out. They came in the middle of the night. They slaughtered the foreman, his wife, their children, anyone who got in their way." A familiar cold rage coiled in Eli's gut. The memory of his own family, lost to that same brutal greed, rose up like bile in his throat. He pushed it down. "How'd you get out?" Clara's eyes went dark, staring at a horror only she could see. "I wasn't supposed to. They left me for dead, but I crawled out of the creek after they rode off, and I took something." She gestured weakly toward a small leather satchel lying on the floor beside the couch. "The foreman's ledger. It's got everything. Names, maps of the claims, proof of what they did." Eli picked up the satchel. It was surprisingly heavy. He opened it, and there it was. A small leather-bound book. The pages were spattered with blood. "Boone won't let that see the light of day," Clara whispered, her voice thin with exhaustion. "He will kill anyone who stands between him and that book." Eli stared at the ledger, then back at her. This was it. This was the trouble he'd spent 5 years avoiding. The kind that didn't just knock on your door. It kicked it down and burned your house to the ground. But before he could even form a thought, a sound pricked his ears. Faint at first, but getting closer. Hoofbeats, coming fast. Clara's eyes widened in pure, undiluted terror. "It's them!" Eli was on his feet in an instant, moving to the window. Out on the horizon, a dust cloud was rolling in, and inside that cloud, He could see the dark shapes of riders, 4 of them, armed to the teeth and riding like they weren't here to ask for a cup of sugar. Eli's hand instinctively went back to his Colt. His quiet life at Dust Creek hadn't just ended. It had just exploded. The 4 riders didn't just approach the ranch, they consumed it. They moved with a predatory stillness, dust swirling around their horses' hooves like smoke from a dying fire. The afternoon sun glinted off the long barrels of the rifles strapped to their saddles. From the shadows of his window, Eli watched them come. His jaw was a knot of iron, but his pulse was steady. He'd been in tight spots before. He recognized the man in the lead immediately. You couldn't mistake him. Copper Boone. He sat tall in his saddle, a bear of a man with a tangled beard the color of rust and eyes like chips of blue ice. His long duster coat flapped around him, and the butt of a heavy shotgun poked out of the scabbard by his knee. The 3 men with him, Clay, Mitch, and Sam, were cut from the same cloth, hard men who looked like they'd forgotten how to smile, if they ever knew in the first place. Stay low, Eli muttered over his shoulder. Clara was already crouched behind the couch, her face a mask of terror. Her breathing was coming in short, shallow gasps. He'd slid his old spare Colt across the floor to her. Her hand was wrapped around the grip, white-knuckled, but her eyes were fixed on the door. Eli had taken the ledger and tucked it under a loose floorboard near the hearth just moments before. It was the only ace they had. He stepped out onto the porch. He didn't slam the door. He didn't make a sound. He just appeared, his Winchester rifle resting in the crook of his arm, casual as you please. But there was nothing casual about the way his finger hovered near the trigger. The riders pulled up about 20 yards out. Boone eased his horse to a stop, a slow, ugly smile spreading across his face. It was all teeth and no warmth. "Morning, neighbor," Boone drawled, his voice slick as a snake oil. "Name's Copper Boone. Maybe you've heard of me." "Can't say I have," Eli replied, his voice flat and empty. Boone's smile didn't waver. "Now that's a damn shame. See, we're looking for a little lost lamb. Blonde gal. Might be a little worse for wear. Happen to see anyone like that pass through here?" Eli gave a slow, deliberate shrug. His eyes never left Boone's. "Ain't seen a soul all week. It's quiet out here." One of Boone's men, a redhead named Mitch, let out a short, ugly laugh. "Funny. The trail says different. Found blood down by your creek. Fresh tracks leading right up to this house." Boone swung himself down from his horse. He landed with a soft thud, spurs jingling a death rattle on the dry earth. He walked toward the porch, slow and deliberate, like a wolf sizing up a trapped steer. Eli tensed, but he didn't move an inch. The Winchester stayed right where it was. Boone stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, his icy gaze sliding over the house, the barn, the whole damn place. "See, friend, I'm a reasonable man," Boone said, hitching up his gun belt. "All I want is what's mine. That girl, she has something that belongs to me. You just hand her over, and we'll ride out of here. No fuss." Eli let the silence stretch out, let it get heavy and thick. "And if I ain't seen her?" Boone let out a low chuckle. It was a sound with no humor in it at all. "Well, then I'd have to assume you're a liar, and I don't take kindly to liars." His 3 men fanned out, their hands drifting down toward their holsters. It was a practiced, deadly dance. Eli's eyes flickered down for just a second, down to Boone's boots. They were caked in a distinctive red clay, the kind of clay you only found up north, near the old Henderson mining claim. Clara's story wasn't just a story, it was the gospel truth written in blood and dirt. Boone saw where he was looking. That ugly smile of his widened. "Recognize it, don't you? That's Henderson soil, or what's left of it. Real shame what happened up there." "I heard they were murdered," Eli said, his voice hard as stone. "Awful business," Boone agreed, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. "But out here, folks die all sorts of ways." The air crackled. The world seemed to shrink down to just the space between these 2 men. This was it, the moment of decision. "You best ride on, Boone," Eli said, his voice low and even. "There ain't nothing for you here but bad luck." For a second, Boone's mask slipped. Pure, venomous anger flashed in his eyes. But then he covered it with that same cold chuckle. "Suit yourself," he drawled. He turned to his men. "Search the place." Eli's rifle came up an inch. The barrel caught the sun. That ain't happening. The riders froze. Their hands were glued to their guns. Boone held up his palms, a picture of mock innocence. Easy, friend. Nobody wants blood spilled. Not yet. But I got all day, and everything I need is inside that house. The two men locked eyes. It was a silent war, a battle of wills fought in the space of a heartbeat. But before either man could make the next move, another sound cut through the tension. More hoofbeats. A lone rider, coming in hard from the north, his horse lathered in sweat. He was young, just a kid, and his face was pale with panic. He pulled up near Boone's men, gasping for breath. "Boss!" he yelled. "We got problems!" Boone's head snapped around, his eyes flashing with irritation. "What kind of problems?" "The sheriff," the kid choked out. "From Santa Rosa. He knows. Somebody must have talked. He's heading for Henderson's claim right now. He's bringing a whole posse of deputies with him." Boone's eyes narrowed into tiny, hateful slits. He spat in the dirt, a stream of brown tobacco juice. "Damn lawman!" He turned his gaze back to Eli, and if his eyes were cold before, they were glaciers now. "That ledger," Boone said, his voice a flat, deadly whisper. "The girl. It's here. I know it's here." He took a step closer, his hand dropping to rest on the butt of his revolver. "You think the law's going to save you?" he sneered. "You have no idea the kind of hell I can bring down in the next 10 minutes. Eli didn't say a word. He just cocked the hammer on the Winchester. The click was the loudest sound in the world. "Your hell's already here," he replied. The next move would be the last one. The sun beat down on the ranch like a hammer on an anvil. The world held its breath. It was that brittle, terrible quiet that always comes right before the shooting starts. Eli stood on his porch, a statue carved from granite and resolve. The Winchester felt like a part of his own arm. Out in the yard, Boone's men were a triangle of death. They moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, each one finding a piece of cover, a water trough, an old wagon, a stack of firewood. Boone himself stayed back, that lazy, confident grin still plastered on his face. He thought he'd already won. Inside the house, behind him, Eli could hear Clara's ragged breathing. She was hurt. She was terrified. But she was holding that old Colt with both hands, her eyes locked on the doorway. "You ever shot a man before?" Eli asked, his voice low, his eyes still fixed on Boone. Her reply was a raw whisper, but it was firm as oak. "Only if they deserved it." A ghost of a smile touched Eli's lips. "That applies today." Boone's voice cut through the heat, loud and clear. "Last chance, rancher. You hand over the girl, or we burn this place to the ground and sift through the ashes for her bones." Eli tilted his head. "What if I don't like either of those options?" Boone's laugh was a harsh, ugly bark. "Then you get a third. We bury you first." He gave a tiny, almost invisible nod to his men. That was the signal. Red Fallon, the big redhead, started moving toward the barn, trying to get a flanking angle. Sam Boyd began to circle around the other side of the house. It was happening. Eli knew he had seconds, maybe less. He couldn't fight 3 men at once from the porch. He needed to change the battlefield, and that's when his eyes landed on the old well. It was a dry well, hadn't held water in years, but he'd covered it with heavy, rotten timbers. And right next to it was the woodpile he'd been meaning to move for a month. It was his only chance. He took a deep breath. "Now!" he yelled to Clara. The Colt barked from inside the house. The shot was wild, but it did its job. It made Red and Sam dive for cover. In that split second of distraction, Eli moved. He didn't run. He exploded. He launched himself off the porch, hitting the ground in a roll, dust kicking up around him. A bullet from Boone's pistol splintered the porch railing right where his head had been a second before. Another shot, this one from Sam, whizzed past his ear with an angry hum. Eli scrambled behind the woodpile, the rough bark scraping his hands. He was exposed, pinned down, but he was in a new position. He'd changed the geometry of the fight. He risked a quick look over the logs. Red was moving again, darting from the barn toward a small rocky outcrop. Sam was hunkered down behind the water trough, reloading, and Boone was using his horse as a shield, directing his men like a battlefield general. This was bad. He was outmanned and outgunned. He needed an equalizer. And then he remembered. The dynamite. He had a few sticks left over from when he'd cleared stumps for his fence line. It was old, unstable, and hidden in a locked chest at the back of the barn where Red Fallon was now setting up a perfect crossfire position. It was a suicide run, but it was the only run he had. He glanced back at the house. He could see Clara's pale face in the window. She was reloading the Colt, her hands shaking but her movements sure. She saw him looking. She gave him a short, sharp nod. She was buying him time. "Cover me!" he yelled, though he knew she couldn't possibly hear him over the gunshots. He didn't wait for an answer. He broke from cover, running low and fast, his boots pounding the hard-packed earth. He zigzagged, a desperate, erratic dance of survival. A rifle cracked from the rocks. Red shot. It tore a chunk of dirt from the ground a foot to his left. Another shot, this one from Sam's pistol, sang past his right shoulder. He could feel their bullets chasing him, nipping at his heels. The barn door seemed 1,000 miles away. He dove the last 10 feet, crashing through the flimsy barn door, the wood splintering around him. He landed hard on the hay-strewn floor, the wind knocked out of him, his ears ringing from the gunshots. He was alive. He scrambled to his feet, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He ran to the back of the dark, stiflingly hot barn. He fumbled with the lock on the old wooden chest. His fingers were slick with sweat. Finally, the lock gave. He threw open the lid, and there they were, 3 greasy brown sticks of pure chaos. He grabbed one, along with a length of fuse and a book of matches. His hands were shaking now, not from fear, but from the adrenaline that was singing through his veins. He bit the end of the fuse, jamming it into the soft dynamite stick. He struck a match. The tiny flame sputtered in the darkness. He touched it to the end of the fuse. It caught with a hiss and a shower of sparks. He had maybe 10 seconds. He took a deep breath, said a silent prayer to a god he wasn't sure he believed in anymore, and burst back out into the sunlight. Red was closer now, only 30 yards away, his rifle leveled right at the barn door. His eyes went wide with shock when he saw Eli. But it was too late. Eli drew his arm back and threw the dynamite with every ounce of strength he had. It wasn't a perfect throw. It tumbled end over end, sparks flying from the hissing fuse. It landed short, about 10 feet in front of the rocks where Red was hiding. "Fire in the hole!" Eli screamed, diving back into the dirt. The world vanished in a roar of thunder and a blinding flash of light. The explosion punched the air, a physical blow that shook the very ground beneath him. Dirt, rock, shrapnel, and splintered wood rained down from the sky. When the smoke cleared, the rocky outcrop was gone, just a blackened crater in the earth, and Red Fallon was nowhere to be seen. One down, but Boone and Sam were still out there, and now they knew exactly where he was. The fight for Dust Creek had just entered a whole new level of hell. The smoke from the dynamite blast hung in the air like a funeral shroud. The acrid smell of burnt powder and scorched earth filled Eli's lungs. His ears were ringing, a high, piercing whine that drowned out the world. Through the haze he could see the carnage. The crater where Red Fallon used to be. The splintered wood of the barn wall. He'd changed the odds. But the fight was far from over. He scrambled back, deeper into the shadows of the barn, reloading his Winchester. His hands moved with a practiced, mechanical calm that felt disconnected from the chaos hammering in his chest. "Stubborn fool!" Boone's voice roared from across the yard, laced with pure fury. "You're a dead man, Mercer." A shot punctuated the threat. The bullet ripped through the thin wall of the barn, splintering wood just inches from Eli's head. He dropped flat, sawdust raining down on him. Sam Boyd was moving, using the distraction to circle around. Eli caught a glimpse of him, a shadow darting between the water trough and the wrecked wagon. They were trying to box him in, to turn the barn into his coffin. He had 2 sticks of dynamite left, and an idea, a terrible, reckless idea. He looked up. High above him, in the hayloft, was a thick rope and pulley system used for hauling bales of hay. The rope ran from a heavy iron ring in the rafters, down through the loft, and was tied off on a cleat on the wall near the main doors. And hanging right in the middle of that rope, forgotten for years, was a huge rusted iron hay hook. It was as big as a man's arm and wickedly sharp. He didn't have time to think it through. He just moved. He scrambled up the ladder to the hayloft his boots slipping on the dusty rungs. Below him, he heard Sam's footsteps getting closer to the side of the barn. He reached the loft, his lungs burning. He grabbed the second stick of dynamite, lit the fuse, and in one fluid motion, he tied the stick to the heavy hay hook with a short piece of twine he pulled from his pocket. The fuse was sizzling, eating its way toward detonation. He grabbed the main rope and pulled, hauling the hook and its deadly cargo up toward the rafters. Then he ran to the loft window at the front of the barn, the one that looked out over the entire yard. He could see Boone, still using his horse for cover, firing methodically at the barn. Eli leaned out, Winchester in hand. He took aim, not at Boone, but at the tie-off cleat on the wall down below, the one holding the pulley rope. He fired. The shot was perfect. The bullet shattered the wooden cleat. The rope went slack, and inside the barn, the heavy iron hay hook, with a lit stick of dynamite tied to it, came whistling down from the rafters like a pendulum from hell. It swung in a wide, terrifying arc, right toward the side of the barn where Sam Boyd was crouched, getting ready to storm the door. Eli didn't see it happen. He heard it, a choked-off scream of surprise from Sam, followed by an earth-shattering boom. The entire side of the barn blew outwards in a shower of splintered timber and red mist. The shock wave nearly threw Eli from the loft window. He clung to the frame, his knuckles white, and looked down. There was a ragged, gaping hole in the side of his barn, and Sam Boyd was gone. 2 down. Now it was just him and Boone. A sudden, chilling silence fell over the ranch. The gunfire stopped. The shouting stopped. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Eli's heart was a drum solo against his ribs. He scanned the yard, his eyes straining through the smoke. Where was Boone? He saw Boone's horse, its eyes wide with terror, bolt and run, disappearing over the ridge. But Boone himself had vanished. A cold dread washed over Eli. A man like Boone didn't run. He repositioned. He hunted. Eli crept to the edge of the hayloft, peering down through the gaps in the floorboards. Nothing. He moved to the new, gaping hole in the barn wall. He scanned the yard again. The wrecked wagon, the water trough, the porch of the house. Nothing. And then he saw it, a faint smear of mud on the back door of his own house. Boone wasn't outside anymore. He was inside, with Clara. A new kind of fear, colder and sharper than anything he'd felt during the gunfight, gripped Eli. This wasn't about survival anymore. This was about her. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed the last stick of dynamite from the chest. He lit the fuse, but he didn't throw this one. He dropped it down into a large metal water barrel full of rainwater that stood in the corner of the barn. Then he vaulted out of the hayloft, landing hard on the ground below, and sprinted for the house. He didn't go for the front door or the back. He went for the window. He smashed through it, glass and wood exploding inwards, landing in a crouch on the floor of his own kitchen. He saw them in the main room. Boone had Clara. He had her in a brutal headlock, one arm clamped around her throat, the other pressing the barrel of his revolver to her temple. Clara was fighting, clawing at his arm, her face pale with pain and fury. The fresh bandages on her side were already turning red. Boone's eyes, when they met Eli's, were filled with a triumphant, demonic glee. "Drop the rifle, rancher," Boone snarled, "or she dies right here, right now." Eli's Winchester was leveled at Boone's chest, but it was a useless gesture. He couldn't risk a shot, not with Clara in the way. Slowly, his jaw clenched, Eli lowered the rifle and let it clatter to the floor. Boone's grin widened. "That's better. Now you're going to tell me where you hid my ledger. Then I'm going to kill her. And then I'm going to take my sweet time killing you." Eli's mind was racing, screaming. He was out of options, out of tricks. He had failed. And then a deep, muffled thump came from the direction of the barn. It wasn't a loud explosion like the others. It was a dull, concussive whump. Boone glanced toward the sound, confused. "What the hell was that?" Eli allowed himself a grim, bitter smile. "That," he said, his voice a low growl, "was the water barrel." Boone's eyes narrowed in confusion. "See, when you set off dynamite underwater," Eli explained, his eyes locked on Boone's, "the blast doesn't go out. It goes up." A shadow fell over the ranch. Boone's eyes widened in dawning horror as he realized what Eli had done. He looked up, through the window. The sky was full of water. The explosion in the barrel had turned into a geyser, launching the entire contents, hundreds of gallons of water, high into the air. And now it was all coming back down, right on top of the ranch house. The deluge hit the old, patched roof with the force of a flash flood. The weathered timbers groaned, then screamed, then shattered. The ceiling above them collapsed. Heavy beams, rotten shingles, and a tidal wave of water crashed down into the room. Eli dove forward, tackling Clara and Boone, trying to shield her with his own body as the world came down around them. The last thing he saw before the darkness and the crushing weight took him was the look of pure, utter shock on Copper Boone's face. The world was a muffled roar of splintering wood and rushing water. Eli wrapped his arms around Clara, curling into a ball as the roof gave way completely. A heavy beam slammed into his back, driving the air from his lungs with a savage punch. Darkness swarmed at the edges of his vision. He fought it. He held on to consciousness, held on to Clara, as his home disintegrated around them. The torrent of water was a cold, brutal shock. It soaked them in an instant, plastering their clothes to their skin, filling their mouths and noses. Then, as quickly as it began, it was over. Silence. A dripping, waterlogged silence, punctuated by the groan of stressed timber. Eli pushed a heavy, sodden piece of roof off his back, gasping for air. He was bruised, battered, but alive. He looked down. Clara was pinned beneath him, her eyes wide with shock, but she was breathing. "You all right?" He coughed, his voice raw. She nodded, a small jerky movement. "I think so." He scrambled off her, helping her to her feet. They were standing in a ruin. What was once his living room was now a pile of wreckage, open to the sky. Water dripped from every broken beam, and lying in the middle of it all, half buried under a section of collapsed roof, was Copper Boone. His leg was twisted at an unnatural angle. A deep gash on his forehead was bleeding freely into his rust-colored beard. His revolver lay a few feet away in a puddle of muddy water. He was alive, but he was trapped. Boone groaned, his eyes fluttering open. They focused on Eli, and even through the pain, they burned with a venomous hatred. You crazy bastard," he wheezed, spitting out a mouthful of blood and water. "You destroyed your own house." "It can be rebuilt," Eli said, his voice cold as ice. He walked over and kicked Boone's revolver further away. "Your life can't." He picked up his Winchester from the debris, the wet stock feeling alien in his hands. He worked the action. It was still functional. He leveled the barrel at Boone's head. This was it, the end of the line. The moment he could finally silence the ghosts. Not just Clara's ghosts, his own. "Wait." Clara's voice was quiet, but it cut through the tension like a knife. Eli looked at her. She was leaning against a broken wall for support, her face pale, her breathing shallow, but her eyes were clear. "Don't," she said. "Don't become him." Eli's finger was tight on the trigger. The rage inside him, the rage he had bottled up for 5 long years, was screaming for release. It would be so easy. One pull, one moment of release, and it would all be over. "He deserves it," Eli growled, his gaze locked on the helpless man pinned in the wreckage. "For what he did at the camp. For what he did to you." "And for what men like him did to you?" she asked softly. Her words hit him harder than the roof beam had. She saw it. She saw the ghost of his past in his eyes. The wife and son he'd lost to men just like this one. He looked from Boone's hateful, pain-filled face to Clara's tired, pleading one. Justice or revenge? The choice hung in the damp, ruined air, and as if on cue, a new sound reached them. Hoofbeats, many of them, coming fast. But this time, it wasn't the sound of outlaws. It was the steady, organized rhythm of lawmen. Through the shattered remains of his front wall, Eli saw them crest the ridge. A posse of 6 riders, tan dusters flying, badges glinting in the afternoon sun. The law had finally arrived. Sheriff Lucas Maddox reined in his horse, his hard eyes taking in the scene of utter devastation in a single, sweeping glance. The dead bodies in the yard, the blackened crater, the collapsed house. He swung down from his saddle, his face a grim, unreadable mask. "Mercer," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Heard there was some trouble out here. Looks like we missed the party." "Better late than never, Sheriff," Eli replied, lowering the Winchester. The tension drained out of him, leaving him feeling hollow and exhausted. Maddox's gaze fell on Boone, trapped and groaning in the wreckage. "Copper Boone," the sheriff drawled, his hand resting on the butt of his own gun. "Figured your luck would run out sooner or later." "This ain't over, Maddox," Boone spat, his voice a weak snarl. "You take me in. My boys will burn this whole territory to the ground." Maddox let out a short, humorless laugh. "Most of your boys are already fertilizing the dirt out here." He looked at Eli. "I'm guessing that was your handiwork." Eli just nodded. Two deputies moved in, using a heavy roof beam as a lever to pry the wreckage off of Boone. They hauled the outlaw to his feet, his leg buckling under him. He screamed in pain, but his eyes never left Eli. "You ain't seen the last of me, Mercer," he roared as they slapped iron cuffs on his wrists. "Law or no law, I'll find a way to finish this." Eli stepped close, his voice a low, deadly whisper that only Boone could hear. "You come near this land again. You come near her again, and I will bury you so deep that God himself won't be able to find your bones." For the first time, a flicker of genuine fear appeared in Copper Boone's eyes. As the deputies dragged him away, Maddox turned to Clara. "Miss Dalton, we found what was left of the Henderson camp. The sole survivor we located told us you'd made it out, and that you had the foreman's ledger." "It's here," Clara said, her voice steady despite the pain she was clearly in. "It's safe." She pointed to the section of floor near the hearth that had, miraculously, remained intact. "Under that floorboard." A deputy retrieved the blood-spattered book. Maddox flipped through the pages, his expression growing darker with every entry he read. "This," he said, slapping the ledger shut, "will not only hang Boone, it'll expose a whole web of corruption. There are names in here. Powerful names." He looked from the book to Clara, then to Eli. "You two, you've done this territory a great service today." Clara swayed on her feet, the adrenaline finally leaving her. Eli was at her side in an instant, his arm sliding around her waist to steady her. "You all right?" he asked softly. She leaned her weight against him, a faint, exhausted smile on her face. "Hurts like hell, but I'll live." "Good," Eli said, his own lips twitching into a small smile. "We got enough graves out here as it is." As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows across the wrecked ranch, the deputies mounted up, with Boone and his last surviving man tied to their saddles. "We'll ride for Santa Rosa at first light," Maddox said to Clara. "You'll need to give your testimony." Clara nodded. "I'll be there." Eli's jaw tightened at the thought of her leaving, but he said nothing. He and Clara stood side by side on what was left of his porch, watching the posse disappear into the twilight. "It's over," Clara whispered, the words sounding strange in the sudden quiet. Eli looked around at the ruin of his home, the bodies of the men he'd killed, the scars on the land. "It's over for them," he said quietly. "But for us, I think we're just getting started." Clara looked up at him, her gray eyes searching his face. She saw the exhaustion, the pain, but she also saw a strength she hadn't seen in any other man. A real smile, the first one he'd truly seen from her, touched her lips. "Is that supposed to scare me, Mercer?" "Just a warning, Miss Dalton," he said, the corner of his own mouth twitching upwards. They turned and looked at the wreck of the house, a testament to the hell they had just survived. It was broken, battered, but the foundation was still strong, and as the first stars began to poke through the deep purple sky, Eli Mercer realized that for the first time in 5 long years, he wasn't thinking about the past. He was thinking about how to build a future. Weeks turned into a month. The scars on the land began to heal. Eli and the deputies had buried the bodies of Boone's men in unmarked graves out on the far edge of the property. The wreckage of the wagon had been cleared away. The ranch was still a mess. The house was a skeleton open to the sky, and the barn had a hole in it big enough to ride a horse through. But it was quiet. It was a peaceful, working quiet. Eli had dragged his bedroll into the barn, sleeping under the stars he could see through the hole in the roof. Every day from sunup to sundown, he worked. He wasn't just rebuilding a ranch. He was rebuilding a life, and he wasn't doing it alone. Clara stayed. After giving her testimony in Santa Rosa, testimony that not only sealed Boone's fate but also brought down a corrupt territorial judge, she could have gone anywhere. The law offered her protection, a ticket to a new life back east. But she came back. She rode back to Dust Creek on a sturdy mare she'd bought with a portion of the reward money. She showed up one evening as Eli was trying to single-handedly reframe a wall, and she just picked up a hammer and started working alongside him, as if she'd been doing it her whole life. They didn't talk much at first. They didn't need to. They communicated in the shared rhythm of hard work. The swing of a hammer, the rasp of a saw, the quiet satisfaction of seeing something broken become whole again. They rebuilt the house board by board. It was slow, painstaking work. But with each nail Eli drove, with each timber Clara helped him lift into place, it felt like they were mending something inside themselves too. One evening, they were sitting on the newly finished porch, watching the sun bleed across the horizon. The air was cool and smelled of fresh-cut pine and sage. "You know," Clara said, breaking the comfortable silence, "you never told me about them." Eli didn't have to ask who they were. He knew. His wife, Sarah. His son, little Jacob. The ghosts he'd brought with him to Dust Creek. He was quiet for a long time, watching the colors fade from the sky. "Their name was Boone, too," he said finally, his voice thick with a pain that time had dulled but never erased. "Different gang, different territory, but the same kind of evil. They came for our horses. I wasn't there. I was in town buying supplies." He took a shaky breath. "When I got back, they were gone. The house it was burned, just like this one almost was." Clara reached out and placed her hand over his. Her touch was warm, steady. "I'm sorry, Eli." He looked at their hands, his calloused and scarred, hers smaller but no less strong. "For 5 years," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "I've been waiting, hiding, telling myself I was looking for peace, but really, I think I was just waiting to die." He turned his head and looked at her. Her gray eyes were soft in the twilight. "And then you showed up, bleeding all over my creek." A small smile touched her lips. "Sorry to have been such an inconvenience." "You weren't," he said, and his voice was clear and strong now. "You were a second chance. You reminded me that some things, some people, are worth fighting for." She squeezed his hand. "You're worth fighting for too, Eli Mercer." They sat in silence as the sky turned to indigo and the stars began to burn. It wasn't the lonely, empty silence of his past. It was a shared silence, full of unspoken understanding, full of hope. The house was rebuilt, stronger than it was before. The barn was patched. The fences were mended. The ranch, once a fortress of solitude, had become a home. And Eli Mercer, the man who wanted nothing more than to be left alone, realized that all he'd ever really wanted was someone to share the silence with. He had run from the world to escape his ghosts, only to find that the one thing that could truly save him wasn't isolation. It was connection. It was finding another broken soul and helping each other put the pieces back together. As the moon rose over the Schrado foothills, casting a silver glow over the quiet ranch, Eli looked at the woman sitting beside him, her head resting gently on his shoulder. The wind still whispered its secrets down from the hills, but now for the first time, it sounded like a love song. If you believe that even the deepest scars can heal, and that home isn't a place but a person, then you need to subscribe for more stories from the heart of the frontier. We share tales of grit, grace, and the kind of redemption that can only be found in the wild. Don't forget to hit that bell icon, because you never know when the next legend will come riding in.